Now let your mind settle into the towering presence of Uruk's architecture, the physical backbone that held its myths, its rulers, and its people together. Imagine walking through the city in the soft light of sunrise, when long shadows spill across baked mud brick streets and the first stirrings of daily life echo between monumental walls. Some archaeologists believe Uruk's architecture was unlike anything the world had ever seen. A deliberate attempt to reshape the landscape into something sacred, ordered, and powerful. Others suggest it grew more organically, layer upon layer, as each generation added its own visions on top of what came before. But, however it happened, the result was awe-inspiring. And nowhere was this more apparent than in its monumental platforms and temples, especially the Inner Precinct and the great Anu ziggurat. Imagine standing at the base of one of these structures, your neck tilting upward, eyes following steps that rise like a man-made mountain. The bricks beneath your feet are warm, almost soft, each one molded by hand, stacked with precision by countless workers who labored in the heat, singing rhythmic chants to keep time. These platforms were not merely buildings, they were symbols, gateways between earth and sky. Within their chambers, priests moved like shadows, carrying offerings, pouring libations, speaking prayers that drifted up into the rafters like smoke. Some researchers believe these temples served as cosmic centers, aligning the city with celestial patterns and the movements of the heavens. Others argue they were administrative hubs, places where grain was measured, workers assigned, and trade monitored. And yet both possibilities feel true in their own way. As you listen, picture the sensory details, the scent of burning incense, the rough texture of clay under your fingers, the faint hum of distant drums echoing off the temple walls. Imagine the cool interiors of these structures, where dim lamplight flickers across columns carved with repeating patterns that mimic reeds, mountains, or divine symbols. And outside, the city stretches like a living tapestry, canals reflecting sunlight, markets buzzing with activity, workshops ringing with the steady rhythm of hammers and wheels. But even as Uruk's architecture inspired awe, it carried a deeper mystery. How did a society with no metal cranes, no advanced machinery, no written manuals for construction manage to build structures that dominated the landscape for millennia? What knowledge have we lost? What techniques lie buried beneath the sand? As these questions linger, we move next to the lifeblood flowing through Uruk's veins, its economy, trade networks, and the extraordinary systems that kept the world's first metropolis alive. As we drift deeper into the machinery of Uruk's greatness, picture the city not only as a monument of walls and temples, but as a living organism fed by an extraordinary economic system, one so advanced. Some scholars say it resembles the earliest blueprint of urban management. Others believe it evolved through trial and error, shaped by the demands of a rapidly expanding population. Whatever its origin, Uruk's economy pulsed with an energy that carried goods, people, and ideas across vast distances. Imagine the cool morning air along the Euphrates as long boats glide toward the city's docks, their hulls filled with reeds, grain, fish, and clay. Farmers step onto the shore with baskets of barley slung over their shoulders. Herdsmen lead cattle through side gates, where scribes wait with styluses poised above wet clay tablets. Every offering, every delivery, every ration recorded. Nothing untracked, nothing unmeasured. Some researchers suggest these early administrative systems formed the backbone of Uruk's economic power, storage facilities filled with grain, workshops managed by temple staff, and a labor force carefully organized through contracts pressed into clay. Others argue that private merchants played a bigger role, moving goods between settlements and fueling competition that pushed innovation forward. The truth may lie somewhere in between. Picture the city's markets at midday, clay jars stacked in orderly rows, textiles dyed in blues and purples fluttering in the warm breeze, metal tools gleaming under the sunlight. You hear the low hum of bargaining, the soft clatter of pottery, the murmur of merchants discussing distant lands. Bitumen from the north, copper from Oman, hardwood from the Iranian plateau, flowing into Uruk like tributaries into a great river. Trade caravans rest outside the city walls, their camels kneeling in the dust as drivers unload goods destined for temples, workshops, and wealthy households. And always nearby, the scribes, quiet, steady, precise, recording every transaction with symbols still wet and shining in the afternoon light. But behind this prosperity lies a deeper mystery. How did the world's first true economy emerge so quickly, so thoroughly, from a society that had barely begun to experiment with writing? What forces pushed people to organize labor, track resources, and standardize systems long before anyone else on Earth attempted such scale? As night settles once more, the markets fall silent, but the questions linger, drifting like faint echoes through the ancient streets. And so, from economy to society, from trade to people, we now move into the next core of Uruk's identities, the daily life, the homes, and the quiet human rhythms that made this massive city feel alive. Now, let the noise of the workshops fade and sink into the quieter corners of Uruk, where the true heartbeat of the city can be felt not in its temples or markets, but in its homes, its courtyards, and the daily rituals of ordinary life. Some archaeologists believe everyday life in Uruk followed a carefully structured pattern built around work, family, and religious obligation. Others suggest it was far more flexible, shaped by the shifting demands of trade, agriculture, and the city's rapid growth. Whatever the truth, the rhythm of daily existence in the world's first metropolis was unlike anything the ancient world had ever known. Imagine narrow lanes lined with mud brick houses, their walls cool to the touch and tinted with the soft tones of earth and river clay. In the early morning, before the sun grows fierce, families gather in open courtyards where ovens glow with embers from the night before. The scent of baking bread drifts through the air as women grind grain on stone slabs, their motions steady and practiced. Children chase each other around clay jars and reed baskets, their laughter echoing through the alleys. Inside the houses, lamps flickered gently, illuminating rooms furnished with low stools, woven mats, and storage niches filled with dates, barley, dried fish, and woolen clothing. Some scholars believe these homes were hubs of small-scale industry places where women spun wool into thread, where pottery was repaired, where goods were prepared for market. Others think they were simply sanctuaries from the intensity of urban life, quiet spaces where families rested after long days of labor. And yet, even in these intimate settings, the administrative breath of Uruk is present. In many homes, small clay tablets lie stored in pots or baskets, records of taxes, deliveries, or borrowed rations. Seals hang from cords, carved with animals or symbols representing identity and authority. A simple household becomes a node in the vast network of the city's economic and spiritual life. As afternoon heat settles over Uruk, people retreat indoors. The streets grow still except for the distant murmur of priests chanting in temple courtyards. Hours pass slowly, the city resting until evening brings cooler air and renewed activity. Picture lanterns glowing softly along the streets as families gather outside to share meals. tell stories, and listen for news carried by travelers. And yet beneath the simplicity of these scenes lies something deeper, quiet awareness that life in Uruk was part of a grander cosmic pattern, one that bound every person to the great temples and the unseen forces they honored. That connection between daily life and divine order guides us to our next step, into the sacred world that shaped Uruk's identity more profoundly than any trade route or king. As we drift from the humble courtyards of Uruk into its sacred heart, the air seems to thicken with incense and ancient songs, drawing us toward a world where the divine was not distant or abstract, but woven into every breath of the city. Some researchers believe religion in Uruk functioned as the core of social order, guiding decisions, legitimizing leaders, and shaping the rhythms of daily life. Others argue it was something deeper, still an emotional anchor for a people facing unpredictable rivers, uncertain harvests, and the fragile nature of existence. Whatever its true purpose, Uruk's spiritual world shimmered with meaning. Imagine stepping into the temple precinct as dawn breaks, the first light hitting stone and mud brick surfaces decorated with carvings and patterned mosaics. The soft echo of footsteps mixes with the distant beating of ceremonial drums. Priests move through the shadows carrying jars of oil, baskets of dates, and clay vessels filled with offerings. They walk slowly, deliberately, performing rituals that have been repeated so many times they feel older than memory itself. At the center of this sacred world stands Inanna, goddess of love, war, and the swirling forces of change. Some scholars see her as the protector of Uruk, a symbol of its vitality and ambition. Others view her as a representation of life's contradictions, beauty and destruction, creation and chaos, desire and power. Her temple, the Ina, rose like a heartbeat from the center of the city. Picture its courtyards filled with worshippers, its stairways polished smooth from centuries of footsteps. Within its inner chambers, incense smoke curls upward in soft spirals as priests whisper invocations into the dim light. Outside, musicians play harps and drums whose tones carry across the city like the hum of bees in a summer field. Not far away, the Anu ziggurat looms, a massive artificial mountain reaching toward the sky. Some believe it symbolized the meeting place between humans and the heavens. Others suggest it was a cosmological map, aligning the city with celestial cycles only priests fully understood. At night, the sacred precinct glows with firelight, its walls casting long shadows that dance on the ground like silent attendants. In the stillness, imagine hearing the murmur of prayers carried on the wind, drifting through narrow streets, touching every home before fading into the darkness beyond the walls. And yet, within all this order and ceremony, a question lingers. Did the people shape their gods, or did the gods shape them? As that thought settles, we move next into the realm where devotion meets power, where temples, administrators, and rulers form the complex political engine that drove Uruk forward. Now, as we move from the hushed sanctuaries of Uruk's temples into the corridors of power that ran the city, imagine a world where religion and administration were not separate spheres, but two sides of the same vast mechanism. Some scholars believe the earliest governments were simply extensions of temple authority priests who managed resources, oversaw labor, and interpreted the will of the gods. Others argue that secular officials emerged early, creating a dual structure where spiritual and political power pushed and pulled against each other in quiet, delicate tension. Whatever the truth, Uruk's administration was unlike anything that had come before. Picture the bustling offices near the temple precinct. Long rooms lined with clay shelves stacked high with tablets, still glistening from fresh impressions. Scribes sit cross-legged on reed mats, styluses clicking softly as they record shipments of grain, livestock tallies, labor rotations, and ritual obligations. They write quickly but accurately, each wedge-shaped mark a fragment of order in a world growing more complex by the day. Outside, officials move between buildings carrying seal-stamped tokens, symbols of authority that grant access to storerooms, workshops, or guarded chambers. Some researchers believe these early bureaucrats controlled everything from irrigation schedules to temple festivals. Others suggest their power was narrower, limited to specific sectors like trade or agriculture. But in every interpretation, one thing remains clear. Uruk was a city that depended on record-keeping as much as on farming, faith, or craftsmanship. Imagine walking through the administrative quarter at midday. The sun beats down on flat roofs. Clay jars full of water cool in shaded corners. Workers deliver baskets of fish, fruit, and pottery, their footsteps crunching softly against the packed earth. Every item is inspected, listed, and stored. Nothing is left to chance. And yet, behind this systematic order lies a deeper question. Was this early bureaucracy born from necessity or from ambition? Did the city expand because administrators organized it so well, or did administrators emerge because the city had already outgrown itself? As you imagine these officials coordinating labor for temple construction, negotiating trade, or distributing rations, consider how fragile this balance must have been. A single failed harvest, a flood, or a political dispute could disrupt the entire system. And so, the people of Uruk looked constantly to their rulers, their priests, and their sacred symbols for reassurance that order would endure. With this administrative machine in motion, the city stood ready for its next great challenge, maintaining that order over the vast landscapes beyond its walls. In the next section, we follow Uruk's influence as it stretches into the countryside, shaping fields, farms, and the lifelines of ancient Mesopotamian agriculture as we drift beyond the crowded avenues and towering temples of Uruk. The landscape opens into a quieter but equally vital world, the vast agricultural network that fed the city's growing population. Some researchers believe this system was the true foundation of Uruk's power, a finely tuned organism stretching across fields, canals, and villages that worked in synchrony with the city's needs. Others argue it evolved more chaotically, shaped by shifting river patterns, seasonal floods, and the relentless demands of an expanding metropolis. Whichever story is closer to the truth, the countryside around Uruk was anything but simple. Picture the early morning light spreading across fields of barley, their golden stalks rustling in the warm breeze. Farmers move through the rows with curved sickles, cutting grain in steady rhythms that echo across the plain. The ground beneath their feet is soft, with silt left behind by the Euphrates, dark, fertile, full of life. But this fertility did not gift itself freely. It was engineered. Miles of canals branched out from the river like veins, feeding water into fields through carefully managed channels. Some canals were narrow and simple, dug by local families. Others were monumental, requiring coordinated labor and constant supervision. Clay tablets from later periods describe irrigation schedules, maintenance duties, and fines for neglecting canal work, offering glimpses into an administrative system some scholars call one of the earliest examples of organized water management in human history. Imagine standing beside one of these canals at midday, watching the water flow past reeds that whisper in the wind. Laborers repair embankments with baskets of clay. Children splash in the shallows. The scent of wet earth mixes with the calls of distant herdsmen guiding cattle toward pasture. Beyond the fields, small settlements form the connection between city and countryside. Here, families live in modest houses, storing grain in clay silos and weaving baskets for transport. Some researchers think these communities served as agricultural hubs, coordinated by officials who traveled regularly from Uruk. Others believe they were semi-independent, bound to the city by trade rather than strict control. Yet whatever their role, these villages created the invisible scaffolding that supported urban life. Every harvest, every irrigation cycle, every shipment of barley or dates reinforced the bond between city and field. And still, one question hovers over this landscape. How long could such an intricate system survive the unpredictable floods, shifting riverbeds, and human pressures of a world in constant change? With that question lingering, we move next into the world of craftsmanship and industry, the workshops where raw materials became objects of beauty, utility, and power. Now let the fields fade behind us as we drift back toward the city's humming interior, where the scent of burning fuel and the metallic ring of tools reveal another layer of Uruk's soul. The workshops, the forges, the looms, the places where human hands turned raw earth into objects that reshaped daily life. Some researchers believe Uruk's craft industries were the engines of its expansion, generating goods that traveled across Mesopotamia and far beyond. Others suggest they developed simply to meet the demands of a population, growing too fast for older village traditions to sustain. Either way, this was a world of noise, heat, and astonishing creativity. Imagine entering the potter's district at midday, the air shimmering with heat from dozens of kilns that glow like miniature suns. Clay dust swirls in the light as wheels spin in hypnotic circles. Potters shape bowls, jars, drinking cups, and storage vessels with confident, practiced movements. Their fingers leave faint, wet grooves in the clatracks of artistry that will vanish once the fire claims the form. The ground beneath your feet is littered with broken fragments, discarded attempts. Test pieces, hundreds of years of craft layered into the soil. Follow the sound of steady hammering to the metalworker's quarter, where copper, gold, and later bronze are heated until they glow like molten dawn. Workers pour liquid metal into clay molds, their faces lit by flickering orange as sparks leap into the air. Some enamel goods or sharpen tools. Others craft delicate jewelry worn by elites in the temple processions. Archaeologists often uncover these pieces in burial sites, pins, and tiny figurines that feel almost alive, as if they still hum with the energy of the hands that shaped them. And then there are the textile workshops, where the rhythmic click of looms fills long rooms lined with dyed wool, woven reeds, and imported fibers. Women twist thread between their fingers, creating patterns that some scholars believe represented early symbols of identity or social role. Others argue the designs were purely aesthetic, reflecting fashion trends that drifted across the ancient Near East through trade and migration. But the most intriguing element of these industries is not merely what they produced, to how coordinated they were. Tablet records suggest standardized measurements, quality checks, and distribution systems. Tools become more uniform over time. Pottery styles spread across regions. Some believe this indicates early state-controlled industry. Others see it as the natural result of interconnected trade networks. Yet beneath the efficiency lies an echo of something more profound, a civilization learning, for the first time, how to mass-produce the objects of everyday life. And with these crafts came wealth, complexity, and new forms of identity, drawing us toward our next destination, the trade networks that carried Uruk's influence across continents. As we leave the glowing kilns and dust-filled workshops behind, follow the distant rumble of caravans and the soft creaking of boats drifting along the river. For Uruk was never an isolated world, it was a crossroads, a hub where goods, ideas, and stories flowed like currents in a great tidal system. Some researchers believe Uruk's trade networks were the first true arteries of long-distance exchange, connecting the city with lands as distant as Anatolia, Iran, Arabia, and even the mountains of Afghanistan. Others argue these networks were far more fragile, driven by opportunistic merchants rather than organized state missions. Whatever the truth, the evidence is clear. Uruk's influence stretched far beyond its walls, carried by traders who navigated deserts, rivers, and highland passes to bring back the raw materials the city hungered for. Imagine standing on the riverbank as dawn breaks, the sky glowing pale gold over the Euphrates. Flat-bottomed boats glide toward the docks, laden with reeds, timber, fish, and jars of bitumen. The water laps softly against the hulls as workers unload cargo with practiced ease. Scribes stand nearby, tablets ready, noting every item with quiet precision. Beyond the river, dust rises from the desert road where caravans arrive in long, patient lines, camels swaying under the weight of precious goods, copper from Oman, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, obsidian from Anatolia, hardwood from Iran, and exotic shells from the distant shores of the Gulf. Each item carries a story, how far it traveled, how many hands exchanged it, what dangers lurked along the route. Some scholars believe these goods moved through a network of interconnected settlements shaped by Uruk's expanding influence. Others think independent traders forged these paths long before the city's rise. Yet the goods end up here piled in warehouses, stacked in markets, offered in temples, woven into Uruk's identity. And it wasn't only objects that traveled. Ideas rode with them, cylinder seals showing unfamiliar myths, pottery styles that appear suddenly in distant regions, administrative techniques mirrored in settlements hundreds of miles away. The world was beginning to stretch, to interconnect, to discover its own vastness. As night falls, the docks glow with torchlight, and the murmur of foreign languages drifts through the warm air. Traders tie their camels to posts, sharing stories of storms, bandits, and distant kings. Boats creak gently as they sway with the river's current. In these moments, Uruk feels less like a single city and more like the beating heart of a world in motion. Yet, with every new connection, new complexities arose, drawing us closer to the next chapter. The social structures, classes, and shifting hierarchies that emerged as Uruk became the world's first true metropolis. As Uruk's networks stretched wider and its influence deepened, the city itself began to stratify, forming a social landscape as layered and intricate as the administrative tablets stacked high in its archives. Some researchers believe this hierarchy emerged naturally from the city's rapid growth, an inevitable response to the demands of organizing labor, managing trade, and maintaining religious order. Others argue it was more deliberate, shaped by elites who consolidated power and crafted identities that distinguished them from ordinary citizens. Whatever the cause, the result was unmistakable. Uruk became the first city where social class could be seen not just in wealth, but in architecture, clothing, and even the rhythm of daily life. Imagine walking through the city at midday. In the temple precincts, officials draped in fine textiles move with measured confidence, carrying seal-stamped tokens that grant them access to storerooms and ceremonial chambers. Their jewelry glints in the sun beads of lapis lazuli, polished copper bracelets, finely carved amulets that whisper of status and privilege. Not far away, tradesmen haggle in crowded markets, potters with stained hands, metalworkers smelling of fire and sweat, textile weavers whose fingers move with tireless precision. These workers form the backbone of the city, respected but distant from the world of elite ceremony. And then there are the laborers, men and women who haul clay, repair canals, serve in temple kitchens, or tend livestock in the scorching fields. Their homes are simpler, their lives harder, their efforts recorded only through ration lists and work schedules pressed onto clay. Some scholars believe these laborers were free citizens performing communal duties. Others argue that many were bound to the temple as dependents, obligated to provide service in exchange for food and protection. Beneath them, at the very edges of society, existed prisoners of war or individuals reduced to servitude groups, referenced in tablets with words that hint at lives of hardship and controlled movement. Yet even with these divisions, Uruk's social world was not static. People moved between roles, formed alliances, married into different occupations, and found opportunities within the city's vast economic engine. Festivals brought all classes together beneath the shimmering banners of Inanna. Markets served as meeting grounds where gossip flowed as freely as goods. And at night, when lamps flickered through clay windows and shadows stretched across the quiet lanes, the differences softened, replaced by a shared sense of belonging within the walls of the great city. Still, beneath this unity lay tension questions of power, fairness, and identity that would echo through later civilizations. And as these currents swirl quietly through the city streets, we move next into the realm where power crystallizes most visibly, the rise of kings, dynasties, and political transformation that would shape Uruk's fate for centuries to come. From here, we step into an era when power in Uruk shifted from temple-led authority to something sharper, more focused, and far more visible: the consolidation of kingship. Some researchers believe this transition happened gradually, the result of priests, administrators, and military leaders merging their roles to manage an ever-growing population. Others suggest it formed in moments of crisis periods, when droughts, conflicts, or internal disputes demanded a single guiding figure, a voice strong enough to command unity. Whatever the origin, by the dawn of the early dynastic period, Uruk had embraced rulers who stood not merely as administrators, but as living symbols of cosmic order. Imagine a king ascending the steps of the inner precinct, his robe heavy with embroidered patterns of stars and lions, his staff carved from polished wood imported from distant mountains. Around him, attendants carry offerings. Musicians strike gentle rhythms on bronze drums, and crowds gather in hushed anticipation, believing that this ruler, this solitary figure, holds a direct connection to the gods who shaped their world. For some inhabitants, the king was the defender of the city, a protector who organized irrigation, fortified walls, and led armies into battle when rival city-states threatened Uruk's prosperity. For others, the king's authority felt more mystical, a shepherd chosen by divine will, responsible for maintaining balance between heaven and earth. Tablets from this era record not only economic transactions, but hymns praising rulers, rituals celebrating their victories, and inscriptions describing them as warriors, builders, and intermediaries between mortals and the divine. Yet beneath these grand depictions, everyday governance continued through scribes, councils, and temple staff who ensured food rations were distributed, festivals prepared, and legal disputes settled. The king was the pinnacle of the structure, not its entirety, and, like all systems of power, kingship brought both stability and tension. Some scholars argue that rising royal authority strengthened Uruk, allowing it to project influence across southern Mesopotamia. Others suggest it intensified rivalries, drawing the city into cycles of conflict that reshaped territorial boundaries. But even in times of upheaval, the idea of kingship endured, refined by each ruler who carved their legacy into clay or stone. As the centuries unfolded, these early kings left behind monumental art images of rulers standing tall, dominating scenes of ritual or triumph. Their presence looms large even now, whispering of ambitions, victories, and burdens borne by a single crown. And as we move forward, we drift toward a new chapter, one shaped not by individuals, but by the great networks of trade, exchange, and connection that wove Uruk into the wider ancient world. From the halls of kings and the rituals of power, we drift now into the pulsing arteries of ancient exchange, to the bustling rhythms of trade that turned Uruk from a lone city on the plains into a node connecting worlds. Some researchers believe that Uruk's rise was impossible without trade, that the city's population could only be sustained through the constant inflow of raw materials from distant regions. Others suggest it was the city's ambition, its hunger for prestige goods, metals, and exotic materials that sparked the earliest long-distance trading missions. Either way, the effect was unmistakable. Uruk became the beating heart of a commercial system, stretching far beyond the Mesopotamian horizon. Picture the docks along the Euphrates at dawn, mists rising from the water, reed boats lined up like sleeping creatures. Traders unload crates packed with copper from Oman, timber from Anatolia, and stones carved from distant Iranian mountains. Their voices echo across the riverbank, languages mixing, deals whispered, seals pressed into clay to formalize agreements. Within the city, markets thrum with activity. The smell of freshly baked bread drifts through narrow streets. Baskets of dates and barley pile high beside stalls selling bitumen, woven fabrics, obsidian blades, and jars of fragrant oils. Some scholars believe these commodities weren't just goods, they were symbols of status, embedded in rituals, ceremonies, and palace economies. Others argue the trade was far more practical, supplying tools, building materials, and everyday necessities. Both interpretations weave into the fabric of Uruk's identity. And then there were the colonist settlements established far from the southern plains, connected to Uruk through shared artifacts, administrative seals, and unmistakable architectural styles. Sites in northern Syria and southeastern Turkey contain traces of Uruk's unmistakable fingerprint: bevel-rim bowls, cylinder seals, and clay tablets that mirror those found in the great city itself. Some researchers see these colonies as peaceful outposts created for trade. Others view them as instruments of expansion, reflecting a form of early cultural dominance. Whatever the truth, the evidence remains: a network of exchange stretching outward like ripples on water. As caravans moved across deserts and rivers, they carried not only goods, but ideas, technologies, and artistic styles. Step by step, the world beyond Mesopotamia changed. And in return, Uruk absorbed new influences, new materials, new opportunities. Yet even as trade flourished, shadows formed on the horizon, shifts in political alliances, emerging rival cities, and a landscape where abundance could turn to scarcity in a single season. And so, as we continue, we enter a new realm, a chapter defined by conflict, competition, and the complex dance of city-states that would challenge Uruk's long-held supremacy as trade carved pathways across the ancient world, and Uruk's influence spread far beyond its mud brick walls. Another force rose quietly in the background, a force that would soon reshape the very meaning of power across Mesopotamia: the emergence of rival city-states. Some researchers believe this shift was inevitable, the natural consequence of prosperity diffusing outward as smaller settlements learned, adapted, and eventually competed with Uruk's once unmatched administrative and economic systems. Others suggest the change was driven by environmental pressures, salted river courses, shifting farmlands, and new irrigation frontiers that allowed fresh communities to flourish in regions previously too dry or unstable. Whatever the cause, the landscape of southern Mesopotamia gradually transformed into a patchwork of ambitious urban centers, each with its own gods, its own rulers, and its own vision of destiny. Imagine the tension simmering beneath the surface as cities like Kish, Lagash, and Ur began rising to prominence. Their temples grew taller, their armies stronger, their merchants richer. The once unquestioned supremacy of Uruk began to feel, at moments, like a memory flickering on the edge of fading light. And yet the city did not collapse. Far from it. Instead, Uruk adapted, integrating new innovations in warfare, diplomacy, and economic strategy. Kings no longer stood only as shepherds of the divine. They became generals, negotiators, and builders of alliances. Scribes recorded treaties on clay tablets, describing agreements for shared water rights, trade passages, and mutual defense pacts. But beneath these peaceful lines lay darker stories: raids on irrigation canals, border skirmishes, and midnight battles fought on dusty plains where the only witnesses were the moon and the silent reeds along the rivers. Some scholars argue that this era of competition sparked a wave of creativity advancing metallurgy, weapon design, and administrative innovation. Others believe it fractured the unity of southern Mesopotamia, creating cycles of conflict that drained resources and stirred uncertainty. The truth may lie somewhere in between, woven into the cracks of ancient walls and the ash layers preserved in ruined temples. Still, Uruk endured, not by brute strength alone, but through its spiritual prestige. Its gods remained powerful, its myths widespread, its cultural memory deeply embedded in the identities of neighboring cities. And so, even as political power shifted, Uruk retained a quieter, more enduring influence. But the world was changing, and ahead lay new empires, forces larger, more organized, and more relentless than the independent cities of old. Now we move into a chapter defined by consolidation, conquest, and the rise of kingdoms that would sweep across the plains and redraw the map of Mesopotamia forever. As Uruk navigated the turbulent waters of regional competition, a new wave of ambition emerged from the northern highlands, kings and conquerors who dreamed not just of cities, but of entire territories under a single hand. Some researchers suggest these emerging powers were drawn by Uruk's immense wealth, the surplus of its granaries, and the reputation of its artisans, whose metalwork and textiles were prized from the Persian plateau to the Levant. Others argue that the driving force was less material and more symbolic. Controlling Uruk meant controlling the heart of civilization itself. the original city whose myths, temples, and scribal traditions were revered across generations. During this period, Uruk's walls witnessed the clatter of new army chariots rolling over packed earth, bronze-tipped spears flashing in the sunlight, the sound of drums and horns echoing across the floodplains. Scholars believe that these military encounters were sporadic yet intense, shaping the urban landscape as fortifications were rebuilt, gates reinforced, and watchtowers extended to dominate the horizon. But it was not just conflict that defined this era. Uruk became a hub of adaptation, its leadership weaving diplomacy with might. Envoys traveled between cities, bearing gifts of rare spices, finely woven cloth, and ceremonial objects designed to impress and bind alliances. Temples doubled as diplomatic spaces where priests, scribes, and rulers negotiated complex arrangements, blending religious ritual with political strategy in ways that still fascinate historians today. Meanwhile, artisans continued to innovate, producing not just functional goods, but objects that communicated power, prestige, and identity. Ornate cylinder seals, intricately carved, steely, and ceremonial vessels that reflected the city's enduring cultural authority. Yet beneath the grandeur, pressures accumulated, shifting river patterns, salinization of once fertile soils, and occasional famine created cracks in the urban system. Some researchers believe these environmental stresses weakened Uruk's capacity to project power beyond its walls, while others suggest they were simply catalysts for the next phase of political transformation. As the centuries passed, these combined forces: external ambition, internal adaptation, and environmental challenge set the stage for Uruk's slow integration into larger empires, each layering over the city's ancient identity while preserving fragments of its monumental legacy. And so, Uruk remained a city of paradox, both vulnerable and resilient, both conquered and enduring. From one mystery to the next, we now move to the era when distant empires claimed Uruk, yet allowed it to continue shaping the cultural and economic networks of Mesopotamia in ways that would echo for centuries. As Uruk entered the era of imperial domination, the city found itself woven into vast networks of authority that stretched far beyond the floodplains of southern Mesopotamia. Some researchers suggest that these empires, whether Elamite, Akkadian, or later Babylonian rulers, saw Uruk not merely as a city to govern, but as a symbol, a repository of ancient knowledge, religious authority, and economic power that could legitimize their reign. Others argue that the city's integration was as much pragmatic as ceremonial. Controlling Uruk meant access to sophisticated irrigation systems, productive agricultural hinterlands, and trade routes linking the Persian Gulf to the Zagros Mountains. The cityscape itself bore the marks of this imperial layering. Temples expanded with new courtyards and altars, administrative buildings refurbished with imported stone and metal fittings, and defensive walls reinforced with mud brick and bitumen to withstand potential rebellions. Merchants continued their work, navigating both local markets and far-reaching trade connections, their caravans laden with textiles, grains, and crafted goods, moving alongside bureaucrats carrying cuneiform tablets that recorded tax obligations, commercial contracts, and imperial decrees. Yet the presence of foreign administrators and military garrisons introduced subtle shifts in daily life. Some neighborhoods flourished under the patronage of officials, while others saw partial depopulation as local families relocated or adapted to new economic conditions. Scholars note that despite these changes, Uruk's cultural heartbeat remained remarkably resilient. Temples preserved long-standing rituals, scribes continued to inscribe cuneiform, and local artisans maintained techniques passed down through generations, blending innovation with tradition. Archaeological evidence suggests that even as imperial priorities shifted, the city remained a hub of knowledge and ceremonial activity, where religious festivals, astronomical observations, and legal proceedings sustained a sense of continuity amidst broader political upheaval. Environmental pressures continued to influence urban life, with fluctuating river courses and soil salinity demanding constant attention from engineers and farmers alike. Some researchers speculate that these challenges reinforced Uruk's identity as a city defined by resilience and urban organism, capable of absorbing external influence while preserving its essential character. As the centuries unfolded, these layered experiences, the confluence of imperial authority, cultural endurance, and environmental negotiation prepared Uruk for its next transformation, the arrival of new faiths, new rulers, and the complex tapestry of Islamic governance that would redefine the city's social, religious, and economic landscape in ways both subtle and profound. And so, the stage was set for Uruk to enter a chapter that would test the endurance of its ancient foundations against the sweeping currents of history. The transition from Sasanian to early Islamic rule brought with it profound yet quietly orchestrated transformations, and Uruk, ancient and storied, became a laboratory for this slow, intricate shift. Sit back and imagine the city as it must have appeared in the 7th century. AD mud brick homes clustered along winding streets, temple courtyards echoing with chants, market squares bustling with merchants haggling over spices, textiles, and ceramic wares, while in the distance, the Euphrates glimmered under a low sun, carrying vessels laden with goods to far-flung regions. Scholars suggest that the Arab forces, arriving under the banner of the Rashidun Caliphate, encountered not a chaotic metropolis, but a sophisticated urban system, one with functional irrigation networks, organized trade infrastructure, and deeply rooted administrative traditions. Rather than razing the city, many historians propose, the new rulers relied on pragmatic cooperation with existing Sasanian officials, adopting their bureaucratic practices while overlaying Islamic legal and fiscal frameworks. Archaeological evidence points to a gradual process. Administrative documents recorded in Arabic appear alongside older Aramaic and cuneiform contracts, reflecting a coexistence of traditions during the early decades of Islamic administration. The construction of Uruk's first mosque, modest yet purposeful, marked the city's spiritual reorientation while respecting the architectural vocabulary of the region's mud brick walls, vaulted arcades, and courtyards that had long defined sacred and communal spaces. At the same time, older temples, fire shrines, and ceremonial halls underwent subtle adaptation. Ritual objects removed, mihrabs inserted, prayer niches oriented toward Mecca, while the overarching spatial organization remained intact. Merchants continued their trade, now participating in networks that spanned from North Africa to India, facilitated by the relative stability and standardized policies of the emerging Islamic empire. Yet, the economic advantage Uruk once held began to wane as new urban centers. Most notably, Baghdad drew artisans, administrators, and traders toward unprecedented opportunities. The city that had thrived for millennia experienced a slow contraction, with residential neighborhoods gradually emptied, irrigation systems neglected, and workshops relocated. And yet, despite this quiet decline, The city's intellectual legacy persisted. Mesopotamian scribes, astronomers, and mathematicians contributed their knowledge to the burgeoning Islamic scholarly tradition, translating texts and preserving centuries of accumulated wisdom. Uruk, though physically shrinking, remained a nexus of cultural memory, a bridge between ancient civilizations and the unfolding Islamic world. Its streets, markets, and temples whispered stories of continuity and adaptation, hinting at a resilience that would echo through the centuries, even as the rhythms of daily life shifted under new hands. And so, as dusk fell over the ancient walls, one could sense both an ending and a beginning, a quiet transformation that would set the stage for the city's gradual journey into obscurity, leaving behind mysteries only the sands could preserve. Section 2 to 400 words, no paragraph breaks as we drift further into the medieval period. Uruk's once thriving urban core slowly yielded to the forces of nature, politics, and economic migration, leaving behind an intricate tapestry of abandonment that tells a story as compelling as its earlier grandeur. Imagine wandering through the city in the 9th century, empty streets where echoes of hurried footsteps once mingled with merchants' calls, rooftops partially collapsed under the weight of time, and the faint glimmer of irrigation channels that had once carried life-giving water through the fields now reduced to silted, stagnant traces. Archaeological surveys suggest that these declines were not sudden but unfolded in stages. Administrative quarters abandoned first, stripped of reusable materials like stone blocks, timber beams, and metal fittings. Residential neighborhoods following as families migrated toward burgeoning centers such as Baghdad and Basra, chasing economic opportunity and social mobility. Temples and religious complexes lingering longest, small communities of priests and scholars preserving ritual practice amid shrinking populations. Some researchers believe this gradual depopulation allowed for an almost ritualized departure, with personal possessions carefully removed, homes temporarily repurposed for storage, workshops, or seasonal shelter, and canals left to slowly deteriorate under neglect. The environmental conditions compounded these changes. Paleoclimatic studies indicate rising aridity across Mesopotamia during the 9th and 10th centuries, reducing river flow and undermining the complex hydraulic networks that had supported agriculture for millennia. The irrigation channels, once meticulously maintained, began to fail control, gates crumbling, distribution systems clogged with silt, stagnant pools forming that encouraged disease-bearing insects, while previously fertile fields became increasingly marginal. This environmental deterioration accelerated demographic and economic decline, creating a feedback loop in which fewer inhabitants could maintain infrastructure, and fewer resources encouraged continued migration. Meanwhile, the Bedouin tribes of the Arabian Peninsula began to exploit the area for seasonal grazing, establishing temporary encampments near surviving water sources and reusing abandoned structures for shelter and storage. Archaeological evidence reveals traces of these ephemeral settlements, hinting at a subtle transformation from urbanized agricultural civilization to pastoral, semi-nomadic use. Yet, even in decline, Uruk retained echoes of its past. The grandeur of the great ziggurats still dominated the landscape, though increasingly dismantled for building materials, and scattered artifacts, cuneiform tablets, and remnants of markets whispered of the city's former wealth and complexity. Uruk's silence became a narrative in itself, a city slowly surrendering to time, leaving questions lingering about the delicate balance between human ingenuity, environmental change, and the impermanence of urban achievement. And as the last of the canals dried and the streets emptied, one could almost hear the city's own voice asking what remains when a civilization fades, and how does history preserve what we once called home. As the 10th century unfolded, Uruk's story became one of quiet persistence rather than bustling activity. A city where the past lingered in fragments and shadows rather than in living presence. Picture the remnants of streets lined with half-collapsed homes, their mud brick walls bearing the faint impressions of doors and windows long unused, while dust-laden marketplaces whispered of commerce that once connected continents. The irrigation canals, lifeblood of the region for over 3 millennia, now carried only meager trickles or lay completely silted, and fields that had produced bountiful harvests now supported only sparse vegetation, grazed upon by seasonal herds guided by transient Bedouin communities. Archaeological evidence indicates that even in this diminished state, human activity persisted in small, adaptive ways. Temporary shelters were erected within abandoned neighborhoods. Storage pits were dug for seasonal grain or water, and partial repairs were made to surviving infrastructure, suggesting a lingering recognition of the city's utility and strategic value. Scholars have found traces of modest ritual activity continuing in the once grand temple precincts, with small-scale offerings, maintenance of sacred spaces, and careful preservation of religious texts, as if the city's spiritual heart continued to beat quietly even as its arteries fell into decay. The great ziggurat, long a symbol of Uruk's architectural and cultural might, stood partially dismantled, its fired brick facing removed for use elsewhere, yet its massive core remained, a testament to human ambition and the persistence of memory through structure. Some researchers argue that this final phase represents a transition from urban civilization to a landscape of memory, where the remnants of past complexity guided the seasonal patterns of nomadic life and informed the cultural consciousness of later populations. Satellite imagery and ground surveys in the modern era reveal the ghostly outlines of canal networks, settlement boundaries, and field systems, offering a glimpse into the city's former scale and sophistication, while also exposing the ecological consequences of abandonment, soil degradation, disrupted water management, and changes in vegetation patterns. As Uruk faded from human memory into the sands of southern Iraq, it became a site where natural and human history intersected in subtle, haunting ways, leaving layers of evidence for those who would seek to understand the rise and fall of one of humanity's earliest urban centers. And in the stillness of this ancient landscape, a lingering question remains: what does it mean for a city to disappear? And how does a civilization survive through the traces it leaves behind, silent yet profoundly present? The story of Uruk does not end with abandonment. Rather, it transforms into a narrative of rediscovery, of memory unearthed from layers of sand and soil, whispering across millennia to those willing to listen. Imagine the scene in the early 19th century, when European explorers first glimpsed the low, earthen mounds scattered across the plains of southern Iraq, an ancient city hidden beneath centuries of sediment, its streets, temples, and walls buried but not lost. German archaeologists, under the direction of Julius Jordan in 1912, began the painstaking work of excavation, peeling back the layers of human activity to reveal nearly 4,000 years of urban evolution. As trowels and brushes uncovered foundations, streets, and monumental architecture, the city spoke in fragments: the fired bricks of the ziggurats, the remains of canals and marketplaces, pottery shards etched with foreign and local motifs, and the astonishing caches of cuneiform tablets, each tablet a whisper of lives once lived. Contracts signed, debts recorded, religious rituals performed, stories told, and knowledge preserved. Sitting among these ruins, one can almost hear the echoes of merchants calling across crowded courtyards, of scribes scratching styluses across clay in dimly lit temple rooms, of artisans shaping metals, weaving textiles, and carving stone in workshops whose smoke once mingled with the aroma of bread baking and incense burning. Modern archaeological techniques, from stratigraphy to radiocarbon dating, have allowed researchers to reconstruct these worlds with remarkable precision, revealing not just structures but patterns of daily life, trade, governance, and belief. And yet, for all we uncover, a profound mystery persists. The motivations, the emotions, the intimate experiences of Uruk's inhabitants remain tantalizingly out of reach, preserved only in traces of their labor and the cities they built. Digital reconstructions now allow us to wander virtual streets, to see the city as it might have been, to sense its scale and grandeur, to understand its innovations in writing, administration, architecture, and irrigation. But even these reconstructions are interpretations, shadows of a reality we can only imagine. Uruk's legacy is not merely archaeological. It is cultural, intellectual, and deeply human. The city gave birth to writing, enabling history itself, literature, and knowledge to survive across time. It established models of urban planning, governance, and commerce that informed civilizations long after its decline. Even beneath the desert sands, Uruk continues to teach us about ambition, adaptation, and the fragility of human endeavor. And so, as we close this journey, we are left with a sense of awe and reflection. A question suspended in the air: if Uruk could rise, flourish, and fade into silence, what echoes of our own cities and civilizations will endure? And how will future generations interpret the traces we leave behind?